Through song we pray, through dance we think of our loved ones. We wish for good health and happiness. May we live in peace and harmony.
Thank you for joining another in a series of roundtables on the COVID-19 pandemic in Indian country as part of the national We Can Do This Indian Country campaign. Thank you for joining us. My name is David Cournoyer, and I am a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe and have family ties to the Yankton Sioux tribe. And it's been an honor to be part of these discussions over the last 2+ years now, right? That COVID-19 has been an unavoidable part of our lives. It seems like at the beginning, we didn't know very much, right, about how COVID-19 worked, how the infections were happening, how to prevent them. And then once we got vaccines now more than a year ago, it seems to have gotten better, and yet the pandemic is still with us. We're hearing headlines that President Joe Biden has tested positive for COVID-19. He's doing well and has managed his symptoms. We're told that he had the original vaccine primary regimen and then 2 boosters, right? He's well into his 70s. And that, his doctors say, is helping him weather this better. He's been working remotely, virtually, without in-person contact. And yet there also is a wave of new infections with the Omicron variants. The BA.5 subvariant is now the dominant strain, making up just over half of new cases, the government told us earlier in July. And that includes many unreported cases, right? Because we're not testing like we once did. Many of us are using those at-home tests, and we're not reporting the results. So the likely number of infections is probably higher than what we're hearing. Hospitalizations are on the upswing, although much smaller than when we were experiencing the original Omicron variant earlier this year in January. So what do? We keep taking precautions, we mask up when we're indoors, and get vaccinated if you haven't already. This is part of the We Can Do This Indian Country campaign. And for more information, go to vaccines.gov, that's vaccines.gov, or wecandothis.hhs.gov. Let me play now to show you a little bit more about the We Can Do This campaign. A social media spot featuring the fairly well-known Crow Indian performer Superman that was produced last year for the campaign, but his message is still as relevant as ever.
Honor our past, be influenced by those who came before us, and rise to make a difference. It's easier than ever before to be a modern-day warrior. Let's get vaccinated so we can get back to making history. We can do this.
Let's make history, right? We Can Do This, sponsored by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We Can Do This Indian Country campaign partners, G&G Advertising, a Native American-owned firm that worked with Superman to produce that spot, and others on social media, on some billboards and out of home placement, and on the radio, as well as Native Roots Radio, which is our media partner helping produce this program. Also, over the course of our town halls, we've had partners such as the Indian Health Service and the Rocky Mountain Tribal Chairman's Leadership Organization and regional organizations such as the Great Plains Tribal Chairman's Health Board. We're talking about COVID-19 in Indian country, and I'm David Cournoyer. Thank you again for joining us. One health expert that I saw in the news the other day is calling the coronavirus Houdini. Remember Houdini, an escape artist who keeps adapting and changing and always escapes, right? That's because the coronavirus continues to evolve and adapt too. There was the original virus, and then we heard about the Omicron variant. Remember the Delta variant? And now we're on to subvariants, BA.4 and BA.5. BA.5 is now part of more than half of the infections in the United States. So the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has ordered the development of new retooled boosters that include components of these new subvariants. Because as the virus keeps changing, the boosters need to change too in order to stay effective. You may have heard of friends who got COVID or family members who got COVID and then boosted of a natural, and then they boasted of a natural immunity, right? Well, over time, that immunity is going to dissipate. And we're hearing that people who got infected once might get infected again and again, right? From these subvariants as they change and the variants that they change. So right now, the key is to get vaccinated. The original 2-shot regimen, remember the 2 shots, first one and then one 3 or 4 weeks later, depending on which vaccine you get. And then the boosters that come after that primary series. Right now, the only groups eligible for a second booster are elders 50 and older and people 12 and older who have impaired immune systems. But that's the second booster. As of now, the CDC is recommending a first booster for everyone 5 years and older. Again, that's after the primary series of vaccines. But if you haven't been vaccinated at all, talk to your clinic about doing so. Vaccination does help prevent severe illness and death that can happen from COVID-19. The vaccines work, and any side effects are much, much less than getting really sick or being hospitalized or dying from COVID, because that's still happening. It's still happening with people from every age group because COVID impacts people differently. Everyone who is unvaccinated is encouraged to get the first regime, those first 2 shots, and that includes children as young as 6 months old. Let me play another spot from G&G that talks about getting your children vaccinated.
Do you know I love you so, and mommy will never let you go. To the stars and the sky, you'll always be mommy's little guy. Hey oh, hey oh, hey oh.
Dakota, in South Dakota, 40% of the state population is 40% is younger than 18. And a lot of those are native kids, right? And many of those kids are eligible for the COVID-19 vaccine. Every person ages 6 months or older is eligible. The vaccines are free and they're available. Talk to your clinic, talk to your nurse, talk to your doctor. It's free and it's convenient. And vaccines help prevent severe illness and death from COVID-19. The risks from COVID far outweigh any risks from side effects of the vaccine. I remember getting my vaccines, all Moderna shots, and for a period of time, less than a day, I was pretty fatigued, and there was some soreness in my left arm. And after that, it was pretty normal. with all of the shots. That actually all four, right? Because I'm older than 50, so I had that second booster. So the side effects for me were not very significant at all, and it did give me an extra sense of protection, doing some traveling, going to powwows. I've already been to one of those this year, having indoor meetings. Why not get vaccinated to give yourself a little more sense of security and protect people around you, your parents, your grandparents, people around you that may have chronic health conditions that make them more susceptible to COVID-19's illness and potential hospitalization. So everyone 6 months and older is eligible for the COVID-19 vaccine. Talk to your health provider. Not long ago, the White House infectious disease advisor, Dr. Anthony Fauci, he recently spoke of the importance of getting children vaccinated. Let's listen.
Clearly, COVID is not over. However, we've made great progress. More than 220 million Americans are fully vaccinated, and 100 million people have received a booster shot. And we've moved quickly to ensure other life-saving tools, including treatments such as Paxlovid, which are now widely available. Among this progress, we sometimes overlook COVID's impact on the health of children in our country. More than 13 million children have been diagnosed with COVID, 2.5 million of them under the age of 5 years, and more than 133,000 children have been hospitalized with COVID. And tragically, more than 1,500 children with COVID have died, including 490 under the age of 5. Moreover, more than 8,500 children with COVID have been diagnosed with MIS-C, an inflammatory condition that may affect the heart, lungs, kidney, brain, skin, eyes, or GI tract. Additionally, just like adults, children can develop persistent symptoms called long COVID. Among these sobering statistics, the news of vaccines being available to protect the youngest members of our community is so welcome. Recently, as you know, the FDA authorized and a CDC advisory committee voted unanimously to recommend 2 COVID vaccine regimens: a 2-dose primary series of the Moderna vaccine for children 6 months to 5 years, and a 3-dose primary series of the Pfizer vaccine for children 6 months to 4 years. These authorizations expand the eligibility for COVID vaccination to nearly 20 million additional children. All Americans aged 6 months and older are now eligible for vaccine. Let me quickly summarize the efficacy and safety data on the 2 vaccines that were gleaned from rigorous randomized placebo-controlled clinical studies, which is the gold standard in medicine. The Moderna vaccine was tested in about 6,400 children and infants. Their immune responses were comparable to those of young adults vaccinated with a higher dose that was determined to be effective clinically. Side effects of the vaccine were mostly mild to moderate and transient, and were consistent with those seen with other recommended vaccines for this age group. Importantly, no cases of myocarditis or MIS-C were reported. The Pfizer vaccine was evaluated in about 4,500 children and infants. Again, their immune responses were comparable to those of young adults vaccinated with a higher dose, again, that was determined to be effective clinically. And similarly, side effects were mostly mild to moderate, transient, and similar to those seen with other recommended vaccines. No myocarditis or MIS-C was reported. The bottom line is that the known and potential benefits of these vaccines outweigh the known and potential risks in children. And so patients and caregivers can be reassured that all children over 6 months of age, including children who have already had COVID, can now be protected through vaccination. This week, distribution of pediatric vaccines for the very youngest children has been started across the country at thousands of pediatric medical practices, pharmacies, federal qualified health centers, local health departments, clinics, and other locations. Children in this younger group can be vaccinated with whichever vaccine is available to them, either Moderna or Pfizer. I encourage you to talk with your child's healthcare provider about COVID-19 vaccines. Parents and caregivers can reach out to their physician, nurse, pharmacy, or health department, or you can visit vaccines.gov to see where vaccines for children are available locally. This is a moment of celebration for parents and families and a historic milestone for our country.
That was Dr. Anthony Fauci speaking at a multicultural health briefing put on by the We Can Do This campaign. Dr. Fauci has spoken in the past to smaller groups of Native people and has shared his advice that everybody 6 months and older should get vaccinated for the protection of yourself and for people around you, your friends and loved ones. In terms of children, more than 14 million children under the age of 18 in the United States have gotten COVID. 14 million. This year, kids under 5 are more likely than other kids to be hospitalized with COVID. So COVID can prevent serious illness and hospitalization. We can't predict how getting infected with COVID will affect kids if they do get it. They might be one of the lucky ones and just have the sniffles, but the risk for something more is possible. Children have been hospitalized, and even children who don't need hospital care sometimes have symptoms that can last for months. The best way to protect your child is with a safe and effective COVID vaccine. It's been tested. Parents and caregivers can get their children 6 months through the age of 5 years old vaccinated with the Moderna or the Pfizer BioNTech vaccines. There have been trials on the vaccines with children aged 6 months to 11 years, and they were designed to look at the safety and to find the best dosage. The vaccines protect children without causing serious safety concerns. Vaccines for children ages 6 months to 5 years and vaccines and boosters for children 5 to 11 are given in smaller doses tailored just for them. So our kids are getting a smaller dose than we got as adults. In many parts of Indian country, the pandemic and its precautions haven't stopped. In late April, they were handing out masks at the United States' biggest powwow, the Gathering of Nations in Albuquerque, New Mexico. In May, I attended a meeting in Anchorage, Alaska, where in order to attend, they were giving everyone an at-home COVID test on the spot as part of attendance. So you had to show your negative test in order to get into the meeting. And last weekend, I attended a youth culture camp that was supposed to culminate in a feast of traditional foods. And the feast was canceled in response to the latest wave of COVID subvariants out of precautions for elders in the community that had planned to attend. So the pandemic hasn't gone away in Indian country. It continues to wear on us. Yes, we're all tired. Yes, we're tired of wearing masks. Yes, we're tired of hearing about it. But the pandemic is still with us. My We Can Do This campaign colleague, Paul Fraua, and I spoke to a practitioner in behavioral health who has some insights in how the pandemic has impacted Native American people and communities. Let's listen.
I've been in behavioral health now for over 10 years, predominantly serving the Southwest Pueblo communities here in this great state of New Mexico and the surrounding Southwest, including Arizona and Texas. And in my career, in my tenure, I've worked as behavioral health program manager for the Pueblo of Jemez, the Pueblo of Sandia, and the Pueblo of Santo Domingo. I've also worked and have supported the 8 northern Indian Pueblos through Circle of Life Behavioral Health Network. And as well as I have my own consulting firm called Wellness and Learning Partnership, where I work extensively with the Southwest as a whole. So overall, in these past 10 years of working with the community, both urban and rural Native American populations, I've seen a great deal of transition, a great deal of trends, and especially now after this continuing saga that is COVID-19 impact our communities as a global traumatic experience.
2 years ago, there were so many unknowns. We didn't know how COVID spread. We were masking, we were cleaning, we were leaving our groceries outside. A lot of people didn't leave the house. A number of tribal communities, pueblos, were locked down. They weren't supposed to leave their property. Now, fast forward 2 years where we know a lot more about it. What are you saying with the people you work with?
Well, it's interesting to discuss the evolution of the reaction. And before I begin, I first off want to thank each and every of our tribal Pueblo governors and leadership, the councils, the governors, and everyone involved in tribal leadership in making the tough decisions to keep their communities as safe as possible. When we first were aware that we were going through a global pandemic with so many unknowns and so many protocols, it really struck at the heart of our way of life, in the sense that community engagement, interaction, and contact, which is a fundamental part of community and tradition, was just greatly attacked. And so when we started to see massive numbers of infected rates and subsequently of passings, there were some really strict and immediate reactions that were necessary to stop the immediate loss of life and to try to protect this community, this global community, as well as individual communities from this great loss. Because we have to understand, when we lose an individual, when we lose a youth, we lose a future member of our community. And when we lose an elder, we lose a connection to our historical and cultural context. That could be through the form of language, collective knowledge, and traditional arts and crafts. So we were in this real delicate and vulnerable state. So before I even continue, I have to thank all of our traditional leaders for making the tough call to make sure that we were safe, physically as safe as possible, with the information that we had at hand. And it was kind of like a microcosm of what we were going through as a nation. Over these 2 years, as we learned and as this disease evolved, we started to kind of see what were the more important steps that were necessary for safety, what were some of the steps that we could use or modify. And this was especially in reaction to the underlying damage that COVID created in our community. We first had the initial fear of the unknown. We had the immediacy of death. We had the suffering of disease. And we had a lot of historical trauma resurface because we had seen that occur before in our communities, whether through other pandemics, direct exposure from colonization and conquest. There was a great deal of unresolved trauma that kind of raised to the surface. In addition to that, the sheer factor of the unknown created layers and layers of anxiety where we didn't understand how it was occurring, and the stakes were so high that levels of stress just started to rise. So delicate infrastructures such as tribal police systems, tribal emergency medical services were becoming overran with need. Public health programs were being overran with need. And if you were lucky enough to be in a community with a health center, they were doing everything possible to get the services, get the supplies, and the education to the community's hands. And so it was a multi-tiered impact, and it kept rolling and rolling. What we then started to realize, once we started to do the vaccination drives, once we started to learn more about transmission, we took another hit. And that hit came in the form of social distancing and isolation. We did what was necessary to keep us physically alive, but culturally and spiritually, we were being suffocated in our own solitude. For a community that builds its strength on the power of the community, on the power of the unity of the family, the extended family, the clans, the kinships, the societies, when you had to remove the practice or you had to limit or modify the expression of culture, it took a whole nother layer of trauma and just enveloped us. We lost a lot of coping skills, resiliency factors, because the one thing that made us strong was the one thing we couldn't participate in because we didn't know if that was a root cause of exposure. And I'll give you one of the greatest examples, and probably one of the most tragic, is when we had a passing of an individual, we have a process, and that process guides us in our mourning and our grief. Now, when you remove that process, we still have the loss. We still have the grief and loss. And you elevate that by having more grief and loss. Because of pandemic, we were losing more people than our normal rates, but we were then losing our ability to process that increased grief and loss, which then led to subsequent other coping mechanisms. We had mental health issues. We had substance use on the increase. We had domestic violence on the rise, and we had child abuse. All of these behaviors were subsequent to the trauma of not being able to process or not be able to build upon our resiliency factors or coping skills that we had as part of our community. So it just kept layering and layering. We then had this whole new layer of trauma that really was the top surface, which now many of us are dealing with after we've gotten all vaccinated. Now we have the long-term effects of social isolation. We have children who have lost out on a year to 2 years of standardized education because they were unable to go to school. They were forced to do school from home. They didn't have the infrastructure for the Wi-Fi, or the Wi-Fi system, the online learning wasn't culturally definable or appropriate for our children who are maybe more accustomed to hands-on learning. It didn't meet their needs. And you layer that on top of the trauma of loss, lack of grief, lack of tradition, and social isolation. It created this massive snowball. And so right now what we're seeing is the unraveling of the disease. And so yes, we're starting to gather again, finally. Yes, we may wear masks, we may not. We're starting to reconnect with our extended families. We're starting to see weddings and birthing congregations and other celebrations of cultural significance. But it definitely is going to take years for us to overcome some of those long-term ramifications. And that's purely on the cultural, on the spiritual, and on the communal side of this process. Now, when it comes to the medical component, I'm not a medical expert. I do work in a clinic. And so out of respect, I won't go into great detail, but we have many community members who not only had COVID once, twice, even up to 3 times. We have many chronic illnesses in our community, which is also can be seen as a byproduct of our historical trauma. Our rates of diabetes, our rates of heart health and issues with several other factors compounded when we started to see COVID complications. And so we often hear about 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds who are passing away because of the complications to COVID. We also look at access to healthcare. Being from a rural community, whether you're tribal, pueblo, or reservation, or tribal land, is far enough away that you don't have quick access to medical care. Those things can definitely impact the survival rate. And so we're seeing not only the issues of the mental health, the societal issues, the cultural issues, and now we're dealing with the medical issues of multiple infections as well as long COVID, which are seemingly have long-term effects on the respiratory, effects on memory, effects on just general body function and mental health because of the sheer depression and hopelessness that I'm no longer the same after this traumatic 2 years.
A lot of men were sort of conditioned, right, to not show emotion, to not be vulnerable, all those things that are about being a man, right, which makes whole mind, body, spirit wellness sometimes challenging. Do you think the pandemic has impacted men differently than women generally?
Because of the time that we live in the progressive state, we understand that gender is more fluid and we have a lot more interpretations of our roles. But as a society, if there is a role placed of being a protector or that of a warrior, when you are fighting something you can't see, you can't touch, you can't taste, that ghost in the mist is what really impacts a protector, because you don't have the capacity to kind of conceptualize what impact you have as a physical male or as a physical provider of safety. And so it definitely impacted many of those individuals who find themselves in that role of protector, which is why, even prior to my discussion, I wanted to acknowledge the tribal leadership, the councils, everyone from councils to governors to lieutenants to ditch riders to caciques to traditional and healing men, medicine men, anyone who practices any form of cultural healing art. They were there to protect us. But this disease created this illusion of, well, it's everywhere or it's nowhere. And it just really had a very hard, detrimental impact. And it creates a sense of hopelessness. And that can also trigger a whole slew of behaviors, from depression to anxiety to substance use, to increase in other unhealthy coping habits. Many of us gained weight and we joked about it. Well, many of us males didn't want to talk about that we were stressed, and we were finding the least of damaging behaviors that we could have done. We weren't drinking, we weren't smoking, but I guarantee you we were snacking. And, we can think about it as, oh yeah, COVID 30 pounds, but for a society that also has diabetes or who has heart issues, there's so many long-term effects that can come about. So yes, I have to admit, looking even beyond the gender role, just as a role as a protector and a warrior, and how we were cultured and raised to take care of the tangibles, this intangible thing of this disease really had an impact on our societies.
We had some elected officials across the country who were arguing from the beginning to keep schools open for different reasons. One was, to have a sense of normalcy, I think, and not to admit that this COVID was that serious, politically perhaps. But then as the pandemic grew and you talked about the impact of social distancing and staying at home, the impact on our young ones, I think, was becoming clearer and clearer that they needed to be in some sort of school setting, back to a routine and that structure that young people in particular need. What do you think the impact is? What are you seeing on young people and adults? I read something about a college professor who was hoping that once classes went back in person, that people would sort of snap back to normal. But his reflections on this is that no, his students that he's seeing are still kind of lost, right? There's still maybe brain fog. I don't know if it's COVID induced, but not back to a sense of how it used to be, and very detached, very disengaged. We've used to Zoom and keeping our cameras off. We've tuned into Zoom, we've tuned into class, we're there, but our camera's off and we're not really engaged. And I wonder how much of that has continued in life, even as we've come back to in-person activities.
Well, you brought up a great point, because without politicizing or polarizing whether we opened or did not open, the impact is readily apparent, not only from the lack of social engagement, and that's peer-to-peer, because we need peer-to-peer social engagement as part of our human development. Children need to play with other children. Teens need to interact with other teens as part of our communal aspects of development. What we saw is also the loss of milestones. So it's not just that you didn't go to school for a year. You might have missed out on prom. You might have missed out on a graduation. You might have missed out on certain things that were milestones within your life. So it's the timing of those milestones and what they mean for that individual. We also have to look at the flip side of that coin. If they weren't in school, what were they primarily doing? And that's the influence of social media. It's been proven that the more usage of social media increases your levels of depression, because social media is a fallacy. It's a hyper social reality based on a structured image to draw some form of reaction. And in that, it's a form of mobile marketing that we don't even know the long-term effects of. But when children are being exposed to more and more of it as a result of social isolation, they're attaching more to a social media platform, which is detaching them from that person-to-person contact. And we're going to see some ramifications for years to come. We're also going to see increased rates of depression and anxiety. It also created a sense of destabilization in our entire society. And as children and teens viewed that, it creates the existential crisis. Well, if this can happen, when can it happen again? And what does it all mean? And as they try to make sense of the world, as we as adults made sense as best as we could, they often lost a lot of faith because we were unable to maybe mobilize in time. We were unable to agree upon a shared consensus, that, hey, should we vaccinate? Should we mask so that schools could be open? But if you have a school that's open, half of the parents say don't mask and don't vaccinate. The other ones do. The teachers are worried about their own health, and we had continual shutdowns because of exposure rates. That creates greater instability and volatileness. And so that adds to that existential crisis that kids face, regardless of what spectrum their families prescribe to, because there was no consensus. We had a general effort. I think in tribal communities, we saw a lot more mobilization because of the response and reaction to our really, really large numbers and rates of infection. And we valued each and every individual as a focal point of community and culture. We couldn't lose anyone, especially for tribes that may only had 500 population. Losing one person is detrimental. They're not a statistic. And most of our communities, no matter the size of that they are, we didn't see it as a statistic. We saw it as a neighbor, as an uncle, as an auntie, as a cousin, or a clan brother or a clan sister. And so it was really important that there was a response, but in that response, we unfortunately had ramifications. And children will have, whether it's through the medical brain fog that they're noting, whether it's just the lack of structural development that they had prior with the school system, or the existential impacts and depression and anxiety due to the lack of socialization, compounded by the detachment of increased social media and technology use.
Paul Frawa, who's been working on this We Can Do This Indian Country campaign, has been listening in. Paul, did you want to ask a question or a reflection?
Sure. Thank you, David. Yeah, Leon, as you said, in giving our leadership great acknowledgement, doing the best they could and the great things that they did do in protecting our communities. I wonder in some of our tribal communities, if we looked at some other parts of the country and they're saying, well, they're not wearing their mask anymore, they're open, and yet we're still closed. And I wonder just some of the reactions of especially our native youth, and we're talking even more specifically as in your work here in Pueblo country. I don't know, just made me really think about, I haven't thought about that, about just that sense of maybe some loss or whatever of being protected and guided by our parents and our adults.
Anytime we've had a massive loss or a great tragedy, and I'm going back as far back as 9/11, our sense of safety was deteriorated when something so dramatic occurs. And as children, after that incident, you view the world differently. There is definitely a pre-9/11 perspective and a post-9/11 perspective. And I think now we're going to see a pre-COVID perspective and a post-COVID perspective. And I say this not only as a mental health practitioner, but I also see this as a father of a 5-year-old who from daycare now into kindergarten has been living in a mask. And as we start to release the usage of that mask, there's that concept of, is it safe? Is it not? And if I get sick, how serious is it? And what does mommy and daddy have to do to keep me safe? And to make sure that I don't develop that fear and translate that fear to my child, and that daily stress, which at the end, we don't know, what risk factors are the worst. Is it more precarious to go to school without a mask? Or is it more precarious to go to church without a mask? Or we catch a baseball game? Should we even dare do that? Or God forbid, should we gather as a family for a large family dinner because we haven't seen them in 2 years? Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of things at play that create that, unfortunately, the sense of hypocrisy that children will look at us and judge us for whether we were successful or not.
I grew up at the Pueblo and off. We moved around quite a bit, as so many people do, due to various reasons, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs relocation program. Ended up in Chicago for a little while, lived in Seattle several times. Every time that I was away, though, I always felt, Hamas was home, and I always knew that we could go home and be safe. Yeah, I kind of wonder now, what young people experiences. I think it's has a great effect on our feeling of safety, and especially because you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, the unknown.
I too was a child that had some travel because dad was in the military and worked for the federal government. How do we take the cultural practice to give us that sense of safety wherever we're at? And when we do go home, if that still doesn't feel safe, whether it's because of the disease or because of the domestic violence increases or the increases of suicide and depression, as we see this as children in our community, what can we do now as a community, as a society, to reinvoke that sense of safety? To, I hate to use the term normalcy, but at least increase the sense of safety, that things are getting better and that we're working towards that, that it's a process.
Every young person needs a caring adult, someone who loves them, hopefully unconditionally, and helps them be who they're going to be, right, as children, and find that sense of fulfillment without too many people pushing them down, pushing them back, telling them they can't do it, right? And it sounds a bit like all of that's been sort of like an earthquake with many of us, right? That foundation has been shaken.
Whether it's the primary trauma of the disease, the secondary trauma of the isolation, or that tertiary trauma of seeing the constant stress from others, which oftentimes we as adults don't realize the children absorb. They absorb everything we feel from our non-body language or nonverbal language, our body language, whether it's our facial expressions and affect, our stress and our posture, our tone of voice, our lack of doing certain behaviors that we did when we're happy. Are we whistling? Are we singing? Are we drumming? Are we doing those things and smiling and joking as part of our societies? Or are we not doing that? Are we closing ourselves off? Are we isolating? Are we yelling at each other? Are we drinking? Are we smoking? Or picking up other coping mechanisms? Children learn from modeling, which is where play is so important, which is part of that socialization where kids interact within peers because they model and they learn from that. And there's a whole nother layer, not just educationally, but culturally. So we definitely are going to see some long-term residual effects. We're definitely going to have to really strive as a community to increase that level of safety. We have to be more active. We can't rely simply on our strength of our community. We have to flex that strength as a community and go more active. The aunties, the uncles, the cousins need to step up and really pick up the children through engagement, through eye contact, socialization, language usage, teaching and modeling for us to heal as a society as we move forward from COVID-19, because we really need to kind of step further.
And you just gave us some really good direction in talking about even aunties and uncles, and how we do need to engage even more so. But what are some other maybe solutions or resources that come to mind?
First and foremost, having the ability to talk and destigmatize, the whole idea of mental health, and that wellness and mental illness are on a spectrum. We want to, destigmatize the idea of you're sick, and we want to just say, how well are you feeling? See, it's a simple play on words, but it's a reframe in mentality that to be well, you have to take care of yourself. And to be mentally well, you have to take care of whatever mental illness that may come about. And that normalization, I'm blessed to see children from the Head Start and up start using more of the social emotional education that is coming about in the programming, whether it's recognizing facial affects, putting words to emotions, working on expressing feelings, giving ourselves time to express ourselves, and allowing compassion, building on those cultural strengths that we show compassion. Our strength and our resilience as a community is that we built societies before anyone set foot on this land. And to build a society, we had a group of motivated, compassionate individuals who were coming together in a consensus for a higher calling. And that higher calling was the tradition and the expression of culture. And so being able to celebrate that pride and then put that into mobilization, it's going to take a lot of effort from not just the mental health, not just the substance abuse prevention teams, but all of the pieces, from sports to cultural to societal to familial, to come together and say, we're going to support anything involving us getting together and promoting a well approach at something, whether it's going for a walk, a hunt, a community activity, anything that keeps us an ability that we're moving forward is going to be very beneficial. It's interesting, though, that we have to do so in a form that is modified. We're seeing communities gather, but they're still wearing a mask. And that's almost in itself an expression of compassion. I may not have COVID, but I definitely don't want you to catch my cold,
Mm-hmm.
And it's just that simple act of compassion can be a step in the right direction, as opposed to the mask is a symbol of disease. No, it's a symbol of compassion. I don't want you to catch my common cold and then have to worry about COVID. We just have to really work on the reframe. But it's going to take a whole community, and there needs to be a focus on culture. There really needs to be that push to reawaken what we couldn't do these past 2 years. It's extremely important, because there's a resiliency factor that in all reality is very hard to quantify.
I'm really, really struck by things you're saying about go practice your culture, right? Go be an auntie, be a good relative. And yeah, we all try to do that, but we need to even step it up more, you're saying, in these times. And that's okay, right? To push ourselves. I think you've just captured so many different challenges in society right now with, the question at the top was COVID, but you're getting at a lot of the other many, many layers of challenges that society faced before COVID, and that we're going to continue to face into the future.
When we enact an effort towards wellness of any form, we're empowering our communities. And I'll take us back 2 years when we had no idea about transmission. We empowered ourselves by spraying our streets, wiping everything down with Lysol, we were taking action. And that action gave us peace of mind that the food we were going to ingest was clean, that our surfaces were disinfected. We were washing our hands more. We were using hand sanitizer. It empowered us. It gave us that sense that we took control of something and not waited for a reaction. We didn't sit there and just be like, well, we're going to be in this doom and gloom. We're going to take action. And I think if we're proactive as community and as family members, and we start to really value that empowerment, our connections will go stronger, and people will feel that sense of love and community that we sometimes become detached with technology. But as we enable it and we empower it more, we'll definitely move in a right direction. And in a way, it in itself, it's its own behavioral health, is the cultural practice, the things we took for granted, you know, the hugs and the smiles and the welcomes of our community, walking and checking in and knocking on the door and say, do you have water? Do you need help cleaning your yard for the community activity? Hey, how are you holding up on school? It's got to be hard with the computer. Let me help you. These are just things that we're going about it as a community. And those are the things that make us strong. That's our resiliency.
Each of us individually stepping up and contributing for the good and the whole of the community. Yeah, absolutely, we can do this, and we should do this. Maybe we got to change the slogan. We should do this.
Well, and getting vaccinated too. Why not be part of what we all need to do for not only ourselves but for each other?
Right. And it's interesting because when we talk about greatness and we talk about goodness, a mentor of mine that I work with families, Mr. Albert Pulley, out of Mesa, Arizona, we often talk about what are we going to do within maleness and fatherhood and family associations and connection and bonding, because that's another big factor in our communities. And we talked a little bit about protectors and as males, how does that impact us? But understanding that we come from greatness, and to return to that greatness, we just got to find our goodness, and that everyone has goodness within them. And never in any community I've ever visited, or any community I've ever worked for, any community I've ever had the blessing to get to know better, has never given me any contrary that the people of that community were nothing but good. They were good. You rarely get that connection. You rarely get that sense of peace, or that sense of just joy and acknowledgement and validation as you do in tribal lands. You just don't. And it's one of the reasons why, especially within Pueblo communities, people come from all over the world to a feast day. It's interesting when you go to a feast day in a Pueblo community, you'll see people as far as Germany, because the sheer concept of coming in, being welcomed, and sharing a meal, it's the most basic act. It's biblical. It's noted in almost every religion, and it's just something that we don't practice it enough, but people from all over the world come to see how it's so readily given and so readily welcomed. And so it's within that connection. If you look at almost every community from coast to coast of tribal lands, there's that sense of goodness is there, almost despite the cynicalness of the world and the polarization and partisanship that we experience. When we go home, we know what's important. The kids, the meals, the family, the community, the tradition. We honor those. And I think that's part of the culture that we need to enact more. And I think that's the ultimate mental health medicine right now.
Well, Leon Aragon, is there anything you'd like to add? This has been very, very enlightening and inspiring too.
I just want to thank everyone for the time. I'm just humbled to have worked with some great communities and to continue my work with other communities. And whenever we can come together as men, and I'm so grateful for you, David, and for you, Paul, to bring me to the table, to have a conversation as fathers and as men, as uncles, as members within our own communities. And yet we're in this brotherhood together, to try to do what we can as individuals for our communities and for the general population, because I feel like America as a whole and many other countries have modeled themselves out of our development of society. Constitution was basically a copy of many of the customs and policies and traditions that we've seen from our other, Native Indigenous relatives. Many things were continuously innovated from what was already here in the Americas. Whether you're as far north as the First Nation of Canada, in the Alaskan area, or all the way down south into Latin America, in South America. But ultimately, we are the models. I really feel that a lot of that innovation of compassion in a family, we're the models. And so we have the ability to show a divided nation how to come together. I think a lot of it is within our practice and within our culture. And so I think as a mental health practitioner, it's amazing to see children and families bounce back from any challenge when they practice their culture and when they practice their traditions, and they start to really engage as a family and as a society. And I think if we can continue to promote that and support that at every institutional level, from school to medical to mental health into any kind of programming, we're going to see this bounce back from COVID, because our children deserve it.
Yeah, thank you, Leon. Thank you.
Our thanks to Leon Aragon for his time and his insights working in a number of Native communities in New Mexico and the Southwest. And a helpful reminder, right? Just to step up and be a good relative during these trying times. While we may know more, a lot more than we did when COVID started, right? It doesn't mean that we can let our guard down. Our people need to be as supportive and patient with each other as ever as the pandemic continues. Vaccines and booster shots do offer protection against COVID-19. And people who are unvaccinated are nearly 2 times more likely to get COVID than people who are vaccinated. So if you're not vaccinated, you're twice as likely to get COVID than people who are vaccinated. And vaccines and boosters do offer the best protection that we know of against severe COVID illness and death and long COVID, right? Those symptoms that continue to linger weeks and months after the initial infection. Masks also do add an extra layer of protection, particularly the more advanced N95 type masks. COVID vaccines and boosters protect people from the worst outcomes of COVID and can help reduce the spread of COVID, furthering reducing risks for our most vulnerable people, right? From the beginning, we've been concerned about those vulnerable people in Indian country, particularly our elders. And as Leon Aragon reminded us, we are in this together. Interrelationships, interdependence is what Native culture is all about. Helping each other, taking care of each other, feeding each other, being there for each other, right? Even when things don't go so well. Be there for each other. So thank you for joining this. This is another of our discussions. We Can Do This, Indian Country. The campaign from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, partners G&G Advertising, Native Roots Radio, and health concerns such as the Indian Health Service and others. We Can Do This. For more information on finding vaccines and boosters near you, go to vaccines.gov. Talk to your health clinic. Get those first vaccinations if you haven't had any. That can help. The science shows it. Do it for yourself, do it for your kids, and do it for the elders in our community. Again, this has been the We Can Do This Indian Country campaign. I'm David Cournoyer. Thank you for joining this discussion, and we will see you next time. Until then, be safe.
Through that we think of our loved ones.